Being constructive comes from God. Being creative comes from God. Being gifted comes from God. Being more than marvelous comes from God. Being more than amazing comes from God. Being more than beautiful comes from God. Being more than gorgeous comes from God. Being more than outstanding comes from God. Being more than outgoing comes from God. Being more than remarkable comes from God. Being more than faithful comes from God. Being more than grateful comes from God. Being more than loyal comes from God. Being more than adorable comes from God. Being more than kind comes from God. Being more than special comes from God. Feeling complete comes from God. Complying comes from God. Converse comes from God. Being helpful comes from God. Being powerful comes from God. Acceptance comes from God. Being bright comes from God. Grace comes from God. Being enlightened comes from God. Being being uplifted comes from God. Being joyful comes from God. Being happy comes from God. Being supportive comes from God. Being admired comes from God. Being wise comes from God. Being real comes from God. Being proud comes from God. And last but not least, confirmation comes from God. Like, subscribe, share this video, and leave in a comment up with it.